Time to talk to the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume, and to take us there, here was the Treasurer on why the temporary fuel excise cut will come to an end on Wednesday night.
One example of a difficult decision that we've had to take has been to stick with our predecessor's timing for the end of the petrol excise relief. We're under no illusions that this will be difficult for people. It's a difficult decision for us to take as well. But we put a premium on responsible budget management.
Jane Hume, welcome to the program. So should the fuel excise cut come to an end this week, or should it be continued?
David, certainly when we were in government, that was the decision that we took, that the fuel excise cut would be temporary, it would only be for 6 months, and it was in response to cost of living pressures that were faced back then, back in March. Now, at that stage, obviously, Russia had just invaded the Ukraine. There were international factors that were playing into the fuel price. In fact, we saw fuel prices get up to around $3 per litre at one stage. So that temporary fuel excise cut was welcomed by Australians that were feeling the pinch in their pockets. Now, fuel prices have come back down. I think the last I saw, they're around $1.80 or so. There will be an uptick, obviously, when that fuel excise comes off. The ACCC have got an eye on it to make sure that it's not passed on in full. But the most important thing is that this is not the only cost of living pressure that Australians are facing right now. They're still feeling it at the grocery checkout. They're still feeling it when they pay their power bills. And they're certainly feeling it when they pay their mortgages. That's because inflation is so high, interest rates are going up, and those inflationary pressures continue. So what we want to hear from Labor is what they are going to do to help Australians with their immediate cost of living pressures right now.
But just to be clear on fuel, you support that temporary relief coming to an end?
Well, that was our policy when we were in government. Now the Labor government have taken the same decision. That's their decision to make. What we want to see is how the Labor government. That was our policy.
But you support it coming to an end?
It was still our policy when we went to the election. We're not in government anymore, so it's their policy.
No, I'm asking what your view is though now.
But my view is that the government will make its decision. What it does need to do though is address those other cost of living pressures that are facing Australians.
Well, this
today.
is one of them. This is one of them, and I'm just asking you your position. You have positions on other things like the age pension, for example. You've announced what the government should be doing there. So on fuel, should it come to an end?
Well, that was our policy.
But now?
And it is our policy. It was our policy. Well, we don't have policies. We're in opposition. We're not in government.
Well, you do. You have a policy on the age pension. What about fuel?
It's not a policy that we can implement, even if we had a different position. Our policy was a temporary cost of living measure for the fuel excise. That's going ahead. The government's made its decision. Now we want to see what it's going to do about energy prices, about grocery prices, and most particularly about mortgage rates, because those interest rates are going up so rapidly because of those inflationary pressures. That's what the Labor government needs to deal with.
It's the fuel that I'm asking about. That's what's happening this week. That'll come to an end. Are you trying to have it both ways here and say we need to be fiscally responsible but also help with cost of living?
Well, when we were in government, we made decisions about how we would deal with cost of living pressures. But now it's up to Labor to make its decisions.
And is it making the right one?
It's making its decisions.
The right one?
It was our decision when we were in government. It's their decision when they're in government.
But I'll move on. Peter Dutton says the US will go into recession. He thinks the UK probably will too. What should be done to prevent a recession here?
Well, it's quite frightening actually when you speak to small business owners just how much they are preparing for a downturn. They can see the signs already. I think it's really important that, most importantly, that the Labor government makes sure that its fiscal policies are in line with monetary policies. Now, when the Coalition were in government and we faced the COVID crisis, that was one of the things that got us through. Our fiscal policies and our monetary policies worked together. If your fiscal policy works against your monetary policy, well, then all that happens is the RBA has to pull that lever that bit harder. Interest rates will go up that bit more. Now, that will dramatically affect particularly those mortgage holders.
So it should be cutting spending to tighten fiscal policy as the Reserve Bank tightens monetary policy. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the Labor government came to government promising more deficits, higher deficits than the Coalition. In fact, it promised $45 billion of off-balance sheet spending and $18 billion more of on-balance sheet spending. I think it's time that the Labor government consider what their priorities of that spending and whether it's a good idea to go ahead with it at a time when winding back your fiscal priorities, winding back your fiscal wish list to make sure that your fiscal policy is in line with your monetary policy wouldn't be a better solution.
So again, what are you saying they should do? Cut some of that spending?
Well, when
or
we
not
were in
proceed
government,
with some of that spending?
When we were in government, we made sure that we managed expenditures and grew the economy
But now,
at the
I'm asking
same
about now.
time
What
as
should the government
lowering
do now?
taxes.
What should they do now?
Well, that's up to the government. We're not in government. We've already proposed one policy that would help people with the cost of living expenditures right now. That was the pension work bonus. And I think you mentioned earlier it's been particularly well received by Australians. That would have given older Australians an opportunity to work a little bit more, to work longer hours, to improve their position, earn a little bit more income to help with their cost of living pressures, and also.
So this is interesting because the one idea you have put out there is more spending.
Well,
so is this really the approach we should be taking when you're saying we need to move in line with the Reserve Bank? Is more spending the right approach?
Actually, the policy we put forward would have helped Australians to meet their own cost of living pressures, older Australians to meet their own cost of living pressures.
It's a handout
and at the
of
same
one
time, it
form.
would have filled that skills gap. In
It's
fact,
more spending, though.
We would be very keen to see any policy that the Labor government wants to put forward that would reduce spending.
So
that would
spend more, but also reduce
That would
spending.
also reduce pressures on ordinary Australians.
So should they spend more or spend less?
No, we would be very interested to see any policy that would manage the payment side of the budget, that would also not put more pressure on ordinary Australians in this cost of living crisis. So we're very open-minded. We would like to be constructive with the government. Whatever policy they have, we would like to see.
Sorry, I'm just trying to be clear here. As Shadow Finance Minister, heading into a budget, should the government be spending more or spending less?
Well, we went to the election saying that we should be spending less, and that's exactly what we took to the election. The Australian population voted for Labor.
Right now,
they didn't.
Your one idea
we didn't
that you
make
put
it to
out there,
government.
your one idea is to spend more? Is that the approach the government should be taking?
Oh, actually, the pension work bonus is a very, very marginal spend. And not only that, but it has deflationary effects. So, because it allows people to earn more when it allows people to earn more, older Australians to earn more to supplement their cost of living pressures, but it also fills that skills gap. Labour shortage that small businesses in particular are screaming out.
All right, but in general, spend more or less?
This budget should be all about making sure that the fiscal policy works in line with monetary policy. Because otherwise, if you've got your two policies working against each other, well,
that means spending
particularly
less.
mortgage holders are going to suffer.
So spend less.
Well, we would like to see managed spending from this budget, from this.
Managed spending.
Well, that's what we did when
Less
we were in
spending.
government.
Is that less spending?
I would like to see a very cautious budget, and I'd like to see Labor reprioritise some of their spending commitments, particularly those $45 billion of off-balance sheet spending and $18 billion on.
In the Coalition's final budget handed down just before the election, you did forecast spending would outstrip revenue this year, next year, the year after that. Do you accept you left the budget in structural deficit?
No, not at all. In fact, in 2019, because of the time that we'd been in government, we managed our expenditures, we made sure that there were budget offsets for any new expenditures, and we grew the economy. We could also decrease taxes. And we went to that 2019-20 budget essentially in balance.
Well,
now,
in balance, it's a forecast revenue of 23.8% of GDP, spending of 27.2%. That's not in balance. That's a deficit, and a deficit the year after, the year after, the year after.
2019-20 we're talking about. Then COVID hit. Now, obviously, we threw the kitchen sink at COVID. We wanted to make sure that we saved lives and livelihoods, and clearly we've done that. And that $50 billion windfall, in inverted commas, that Jim Chalmers has been talking about is testament to that. That's because the Coalition government left the economy in good shape, left the budget in an improving position.
But even after that windfall, thanks to high commodity prices and the jobs market,
I'll take you to task on that one. I don't think it is. I don't think it is all high commodity prices.
28 billion of the 50 is high commodity prices.
Is increased revenues, not high commodity prices. 28 billion is increased revenues. Now, we haven't seen the final budget outcome, David, so we don't know what is made up of that.
But even after all that, you've got a $30 billion deficit. That's not That's a structural deficit, isn't it?
Well, it's $30 billion that we had a plan, a credible plan back to surplus and a credible plan to pay down the debt.
What was the credible plan back to surplus? Because we didn't see it.
Well, that was in the budget in 2022. Now,
you have to point that to me because every year in the forward estimates in that budget is in deficit.
But it was a credible plan towards surplus.
When?
Now, well, it was after the forwards, but it was a credible plan.
Not in
back
the next
to
10
surplus.
years. Not in the next 10 years.
When we were in government, we reduced expenditures, we managed expenditures, we lowered taxes and we grew the economy. And that's how we brought the budget back into surplus in 2019. COVID changed all that. We know it changed all that. But Philip Lowe has said it. The only way that you can improve the budget position is to either raise taxes, to decrease payments, or to grow the economy.
And you're up for that?
Well, this is now the government's job to make a decision.
Are you up to support them on that?
Well, no, that's the government's decision as to what it is that they would do.
But
we will not support raising taxes, and we've said that.
Right, so you're ruling out one of Phil Lowe's, one of the Reserve Bank Governor's options.
Well, we know that they're the three options. What we would like to see is this government manage its expenditure
but only through two of those
manage
options.
its expenditure in such a way that it doesn't need to do that.
OK. Let me ask you about a few things coming up in Parliament this week. The government's going to introduce its legislation that it promised to boost childcare subsidies. Will you support that?
Well, we do believe that childcare is a really significant cost and a really important service for many Australian families. When we were in government, we did the largest reform to childcare in 40 years and, in fact, reduced the costs of childcare and made sure that families were subsidised, particularly those that were working, those that were studying, those that were volunteering.
So will you increase?
Which is particularly
will you support
important.
increased subsidies?
We actually are investing $11 billion a year in childcare subsidies already. $11 billion.
So will you support
Labor's policy will increase that by $5.1 billion. And even Jim Chalmers himself has said that that is a very hefty price tag.
So will you support it?
Well, I haven't seen the legislation yet and I don't know what the outcomes will be. We want to make sure that families that have childcare costs can make decisions that suit them, that there isn't an effective marginal tax rate.
So you opposed it before the election, but now you're open to looking at it.
Well, they won the election. Labor won the election with this commitment, but I haven't seen the details of it. I want to make sure that it's not just they say it's a productivity measure. Let's check that out. They say it's a participation measure. That may well only be at the margins. I think it's really important that we see the analysis behind any childcare policy to make sure that it's actually delivering on its promise.
What about the legislation to cut taxes and duties on electric vehicles and hybrid cars? Will you support that?
Well, no, we've actually already said that we won't be supporting
that taxes,
legislation. We won't be supporting that legislation because it's really poor policy. The electric vehicles, reduction of the FBT on electric vehicles, the government couldn't explain whether it would actually reduce emissions. The industry couldn't explain whether it would increase the take-up of electric vehicles. It's enormously costly. It runs to the billions and billions of dollars. And if you really can't prove the effect of a policy decision, well, why would you go ahead with it?
You'll support the higher taxes.
Why would you go ahead with it? No, existing taxes. Let's be frank. It's an existing tax. So
we'll see if it goes through.
And if it doesn't make any difference, well, why on earth would you remove it?
The National Anti-Corruption Commission legislation is also being introduced this week. Peter Dutton says he supports a federal ICAC. Scott Morrison, you'd remember, called ICAC a kangaroo court. Where do you stand on this?
Well, we support anything that will stamp out corruption in public life. We've always said that we supported the introduction of a federal ICAC. But this is really important legislation to get right, because if you get it wrong, it has dire consequences. Now, we haven't seen the details of Labor's bill yet, so we want to ask those questions. Will there be procedural fairness and natural justice? Will hearings be in public or will they be in private? Or when will they be one? When will they be one or the other?
Should they be in public? Are those hearings?
Will legal fees be subsidised? Because what we've seen in other states and other jurisdictions is that when an ICAC goes wrong, well, it actually affects people's reputations, it affects their employability.
So you won't support...
People have taken their lives because of a poorly functioning ICAC. Now,
so would you support
we do not
public
want
hearings?
to see that happen again.
Would you support public hearings?
Well, I haven't seen the legislation, so let's wait. Let's wait until we see.
What's your view on public hearings?
It really depends on the circumstances, doesn't it? And I think that's probably...
So you're open to that?
It's not up to me to be open to that. I want to see the legislation, all details of the legislation, before we make a call. What is most important, though, is to understand if you get an ICAC wrong, it will actually deter good people from entering public life. That would be a disaster. We want the best and the brightest to join. But if the risk to your professional reputation, if the risk to your bank balance, if the risk to your life and your livelihood is there, just because you can politicise a corruption charge, well, why would anybody enter public life? And I'm not just talking about politicians, I'm talking about public officials.
Okay, just finally, you're co-chairing a review of the Liberal Party's election campaign with Brian Loughnane, the former party director. Are you holding back the release of this until after the Victorian election?
Well, actually, this is a really important review. We want to understand, for the sake of our voters, for the sake of our party members and for the sake of our parliamentarians, what we could do differently in order to make sure that we return to government. Now, there's been like 600 or so submissions. It's an awful lot to get through. There's a lot of opinions out there. We want to make sure that we provide something that is strong and constructive and implementable. And the timing of that really is determined by how long it's going to take to build those recommendations. There's nothing else in it.
Okay. Nigel Farage, the former Brexit Party leader, has given you a bit of advice. While he's here, he says the seats lost to the Teal independents are gone. The Liberals should forget about trying to win them back. Does he have a point?
Well, actually, because neither party received a particularly high primary vote in this election, I think this is something that we should all be concerned about. And in fact, there's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. 20 years ago, about half of the 151 House of Representatives seats were won on primary vote. In 2013, that had dropped to 50. In the last election, it was 15. So there is no such thing as a safe seat.
So you're not giving up on the Teal seats?
Oh, we don't give up on any seat. But there is no such thing as a safe seat. And that's an important lesson for all political parties.
Jane Hume, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you, David.